Hi, I am here with Dr. Currie-Gregg, and she is going to show us a little presentation before we ask her some more questions about being an astronaut.
Okay, great. Well, good morning. I'm Dr. Currie-Gregg. I'm a professor of engineering practice at Texas A&M University in the Industrial and Systems Engineering Department. I've been at A&M for 1 year. Prior to that, I was at NASA for 30 years. For 15 of those 30 years, I was an active astronaut. I flew 4 times on the space shuttle, and then I was in engineering following the Columbia accident in 2003. So there's been a lot in the news in the last 24 hours about the International Space Station. We are coming up on the 20th anniversary of the space station. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about that, and then maybe that'll set the stage for some questions that you guys might have. So I think you can see the slides. So I'll go ahead and continue. Can you see the slides okay?
Yeah, we can.
All right. So the first element was actually built over in Russia, and it was launched from the Baikonur Cosmodrome, which is where the astronauts and cosmonauts launched from yesterday. If you're not aware, we had an in-flight abort during that launch. They were launching to the International Space Station. Thankfully, because of the launch abort system, after a fairly exciting entry and landing, they landed okay, and all appears to be well from the crew perspective, but the vehicle was lost. And right now, NASA will be evaluating how long it will take to return to flight. The very first thing they have to figure out is what happened with that Soyuz rocket. The second stage had an anomaly, and when that second stage had an anomaly, it kicked in the launch abort system to save the crew and return them to Earth. So that will take a while to figure out the cause of the accident. In the meantime, there are 3 astronauts, 1 US, 1 German, 1 Russian. A friend of mine, Serena Anon, who's a medical doctor, is the US astronaut. So she's on board right now. They will come home in a Soyuz that's attached to the space station, and the propulsion that is in that vehicle has a lifetime around 200 days, and so there is not an endless time that they can stay on the space station for a whole host of reasons, but not the least of which they will need to get in that Soyuz rocket and use it to come home before that propellant shelf life, if you will, expires. So that's kind of the current status. They are evaluating whether or not the station can be decrewed and go in an autonomous capability. We have never done that since the very first of the program. But over the next days and weeks and months, a lot more to come. So you should probably follow the news into what's going on with the human spaceflight program. This is a pretty significant event that occurred yesterday. So how did the space station start? Well, on November 20th, 1998, the first element was launched on an unmanned rocket. It was also launched on a proton rocket out of Baikonur. If you can see in the picture, underneath that black shroud at the top of the rocket is that first element, the functional cargo block, also referred to as Zarya. So it was launched and made it to orbit safely. The solar arrays were extended. All was good. And 2 weeks later, down at the Kennedy Space Flight Center, was our turn to go launch. We had a crew of 6, 5 US astronauts, 1 Russian cosmonaut, Sergei Krikalev. We flew on the Space Shuttle Endeavour, and in the Space Shuttle Endeavour, as you can see on the far right, we had the Unity module. So that was the first US module. All US segments and most European segments and Japanese segments were all taken to orbit in the shuttle's payload bay. So you're seeing a view from the top looking down the shuttle payload bay. The payload bay doors are on the side, they're open. So that payload bay was 15 feet wide and about 30 feet long. So all the station components are no more than 15 feet in diameter because they had to be carried to space in the shuttle's payload bay. So we launched on the Space Shuttle Endeavour, carrying that element to orbit, and took it to orbit 215 miles up to go and meet and made it to Zarya that was already on orbit. This is a little bit about what it's like to fly in space. See if the video will start. There we go. So hopefully, yeah, I think you can hear the video. So T-minus 6 seconds, the main engines come up to power. Sometimes that happens when we're streaming. 375,000 pounds of horsepower out of each one of those engines. Solid rocket boosters produce about 3.1 million pounds of thrust, so you have about 7 million pounds of thrust coming off the pad. The vehicle itself weighs about 4 million pounds, but you leave town pretty quickly. By the time you get to the top of the launch tower, you're already going 100 miles an hour. That's actually my head in the video that you can see. A lot of vibration, a lot of acceleration. We actually roll hits down to reduce the stress on the vehicle. As I said, first stage is pretty dynamic. Lots of vibration, lots of rapid acceleration, and we fly on those solid rocket boosters for the first 2 minutes and 20 seconds. At that time, they're jettisoned from the vehicle, and you'll see that sequence here in a second as they're jettisoned. Some explosive charges go off. You can actually see that explosion, feel that explosion. Then the solid rocket boosters fall back down to the Earth, and there are ships waiting to retrieve them. So out of the thrust room comes out parachutes, and so they safely parachute back to land.
Wow.
So once we get to orbit, we configure that rocket ship into an orbiting vehicle or to a work platform. This is the robotic workstation in the back. We have 2 hand controllers, one for rotation over here on the right, one for translation that's just out of view up here on the left. We have television monitors, so we have cameras out in the payload bay of the shuttle, as well as cameras on the International Space Station to view the exterior, and then we can see those views so that we know the trajectory cues to manipulate the robotic arm. So this is taking the US node out of the payload bay, so I've grappled it with the robotic arm. You can see that robotic arm in the picture here. That grapple fixture is like a huge pin, and inside the grapple fixture, which is almost like a canister, is a wire snare. So that when you maneuver the arm down over that fixture, you can then close the snares. They grapple that pin, pull back to rigidize it, and then you can move whatever you've grappled, whether it be a spacecraft or a work platform for a spacewalking astronaut, and then you can move that around as a single unit on the end of the arm. That arm is a 6 degree of freedom arm. So just like a human arm, it has a shoulder joint and an elbow joint and a wrist joint. And at the end, in that relative wrist of the arm, you can move in 3 degrees of freedom. So you can move in pitch, you can move in yaw, which would kind of be this way, and then you can also roll it with respect to the arm. And that's how we maneuver the vehicle that we've grappled around. You can also move it in translation, so that would be fore and aft in the payload bay. It would be left and right in the payload bay, and then up and down. So you move all 6 degrees of freedom simultaneously to maneuver whatever you've grappled around appropriately. So the task on this day, which is the day prior to rendezvous, is to take the Unity element out of the payload bay and attach it to the docking system here. That docking system is then connected to the space shuttle, and the nose of the space shuttle is forward in the picture. So we could actually then translate, once everything was mated, translate into that docking system and then up into the first elements of station. So this is Zarya when we saw it on orbit for the first time. As I said, got to orbit fine, came out of the shroud, the solar arrays extended, and the grapple fixture on Zarya is down in this portion of the spacecraft. So at this point, we need to do a rendezvous. We're moving at 17,500 miles an hour. So we're going 5 miles a second. And so the task is basically to come up and fly formation on this vehicle, fly formation at Mach 25. And then once all the relative motion, relative rates between the two vehicles are stationary, then you maneuver the arm over and grapple the spacecraft. So this is on rendezvous morning. I was the flight engineer on the flight. This is the commander and the pilot. There's also a way to fly the vehicle from the aft portion of the spacecraft, and that's when you're in close proximity to something like a rendezvousing vehicle. You can look out the overhead and out the back windows and fire the jets appropriately. So the way we do a rendezvous is literally we speed up to slow down, or we slow down to speed up, because when we speed up, we actually slightly raise our orbit in relation to what we are currently. When we raise our orbit, that actually decreases our relative speed. So that's why I say we actually speed up to slow down. Conversely, if you were to decrease your velocity, we would actually slightly decrease our orbit. And when we decrease our orbit, then just think of it as a racetrack. Suddenly now you're running on the inside of the track. And so with respect to another orbiting element, we're going to catch up to it, because we're literally flying a smaller orbit, a smaller racetrack. And so our relative speed can increase with respect to that orbiting spacecraft. The way we do that is to fire jets on the shuttle. So you can see we're firing one of the aft jets. You can see the interaction of the propellant and the atomic oxygen. This is the tail of the space shuttle here, and you can see that little plume that's set up around that tail as that interaction takes place. So everything went according to plan. Rendezvous are already pretty spectacular maneuvers, pretty difficult maneuvers, and then grappling, spectacular maneuver. And so we finally grappled it, and then we had to put it in place. Now we only have, once we rendezvoused and we had it roughly in this position, we only had 90 seconds to go grapple it. And that's because at that point we can't fire the jets on the shuttle, because if we did, we might plume the spacecraft. If we plume the spacecraft with the jets, it could set a rate such that it might start tumbling, it might start translating away from us. So we had to secure the jets on the space shuttle. And at that point, we only have 90 seconds to go in and grapple it. After that point, orbital mechanics takes place, because you can see the spacecraft is higher than us. And so since we're in slightly different orbits, our relative speeds are changing. So our relative speeds would change so much that the spacecraft would literally fly away from us within 90 seconds. So we just had 90 seconds to execute that maneuver. Now to put it in place, so now we've got to put it on top of the US node. We're basically at the full extension of that 50-foot arm to get it up in place and up into this area to execute the connection or the docking. This is a video showing the US node coming out of the payload bay. This video will appear to be moving very slowly because I was moving the arm very slowly. As I said, this vehicle was almost 15 feet in diameter, and the shuttle bay is 15 feet across. Literally, we had half an inch of clearance on either side. This was connecting the US node to the docking system. Then that docking system, these isolators retract, make a hard mate. So now we've got it mated to the shuttle. And then we were ready for the rendezvous sequence. So you'll see that next. So here's Zarya when we first saw it. We use almost like a police radar gun to look at the relative rates and position of a rendezvousing vehicle. Then when it gets much closer, our view became obscured out the aft window, because you can see we had put the first US segment back there. So once we got it very, very close, our view was slightly obscured. So we relied entirely on our television camera views and the view out the overhead window. So this is Zarya. As we approach it, again, it looks kind of static, but we're flying at Mach 25. So we're basically matching the exact same speed. So the arm's all in position, ready to go over and grapple the spacecraft. These are some of the computer tools that we use to look at our rendezvous trajectory. Again, this is the end of the arm, so we're slowly, literally flying so that Russian spacecraft kind of comes down into the payload bay of the shuttle. I was all ready that once we secured the jets to take over flying the arm. So this is the target on the end of that grapple fixture. You can see the grapple fixture pin. You can see the end of the arm. I'm going to maneuver it over that grapple fixture. Nobody said anything. Everybody's kind of holding their breath during this, because if we missed it, we weren't going to have a space station. So it's a pretty critical maneuver. Once I was all the way down to the pin, then closed the snares, grappled it, and at that point, everybody was pretty happy, both on the ground and in the cockpit, and we'll see that in a second. This was the only element that was free flyer captured in the space station sequence. The rest of them were executed by a docking. So you can see everybody's pretty happy that everything worked out. Now remember, that's the first time we had executed that maneuver. All up until that point, we had just been in simulators, and we had a simulator of a Russian vehicle that was built over in Moscow and a simulator of a US vehicle that was built in the United States. So we were really hoping our simulations were accurate, which of course they ended up being pretty accurate. Then we executed 3 days of spacewalks. At NASA, we call those extravehicular activities. And you can see in the reflection of his helmet, that's the nose of the spacecraft, that's our overhead windows and the payload bay here. So during those 3 spacewalks, we connected all the electrical connections, fluid connections on both elements. And then once they were all connected, we literally could go in, turn on the lights, and enter the space station for the first time. So you can see when the vehicles were launched, those wire bundles were tied down on the exterior of the spacecraft, and we needed to route those and then literally make those electrical connections 215 miles up in space. So you can see Earth in the background. Of course, about 80% of the Earth is water, so you fly over a whole lot of ocean. This is what clouds look like from space as you're looking back at the ocean. Finally, it was time to go inside. So again, we could translate through a tunnel. Everything was pressurized. We were just in a shirt sleeve environment. This is the hatch of the Russian vehicle. And so you've got the US commander and the Russian cosmonaut getting ready to enter the Russian vehicle. This is inside the US node, much, much larger than inside the shuttle. Very nice working environment. You'll see that there's a color on each area of the hatch. Now, each of the modules has a different color scheme. And the reason for that is an emergency, if it were to be filled with smoke and you couldn't read labels to know that, you know, this one says to the cupola, one says to the lab. So if we couldn't figure out which way was which, because of course in space there is no right side up or upside down, you're only, you know, your neurovestibular system doesn't feel like you're upside down. And so the only way you know what, you know, a relative up is just from a label on a wall. So if smoke is obscuring that atmosphere, hopefully you can still see some colors, and those colors will tell you, this salmon pink tells you you're in the US node, the US lab is blue, and so forth. So they did it for human factors reasons, to give individuals another and a different sort of cue in the space station. I will tell you, even just in these 2 first elements, you could kind of get lost in space, and that if I was working upside down and backwards, I was making a connection down here. When I would pull my head up, it would take me a little bit of time to figure out, you know, which way to the Russian segment, which way to the US segment, which way was relative up and relative down. However, this is in the Russian segment, Zarya. In the Russian segment, you always knew kind of where you were. And that's because they do a couple of things. First of all, it's a much tighter vehicle. This is the relative floor, and it's also color-coded. On the relative ceiling is where the lights are. We put our lights all throughout the vehicle in the US segment. They only light the relative ceiling in the Russian segment. You also see these bands and handrails. Those are translation devices because, of course, you're free floating. So to translate from one end of the vehicle to the other, you use these translation aids. When you get really good, you can kind of be like Superman and just fly through, but it takes a while for some people to adapt to microgravity, and if they're not adapted, they push off a little too hard and they slam into the ceiling or slam into the wall and knock all the equipment off. So we have these translation aids to assist us. Never know where you find a crew member. This is actually inside one of the compartments. So one of our Russian crew members we actually had a slight problem with one of our ventilation systems, so he climbed down in there to help fix it. So when we left, this is how we left the first two elements. This is the US node, this is Zarya, and this was the beginning of the space station back at the end of 1998. Now, just a year later, they brought up the Russian service module. When they brought that up, we could now have people living on board the space station. And since that time, in 2000, we have had permanent human presence in the space station right up until today. So this discussion that's ensuing about whether or not to decrew the station, as I said, would be a highly significant event because we have had permanent human presence now for a significant. Once our jobs were all done, it was time to come home. In the space shuttle, we wore these pressure suits. We wore them in case we had an anomaly where we had to escape the vehicle. That vehicle did not land on parachutes. Of course, it landed like almost like an airliner, even though it didn't have air-breathing engines. So it's basically like a 200,000-pound glider. And so if we had an anomaly, we had to use a telescoping pole and hook up our parachutes to that pole and slide down the pole to clear the wing of the space shuttle and then parachute down to either water or land. So that's the reason why we have this pressure suit. Underneath this pressure suit, we have a G suit. That G suit helps to keep the blood up to our upper body, helps to keep us conscious. The G forces coming in on entry weren't that high, maybe up to 2 Gs. But the problem is you've been in microgravity now for 2 weeks or so, and so your baroreceptors in your body become dormant. And so in order to keep your blood pressure at the same level, we wear a G suit to kind of push that blood back up into our upper body, and it's called orthostasis, to maintain a constant blood pressure so that you don't pass out. It would be like if you were in bed for a very long time sick, and you were to sit up very rapidly. It would take your body some time to respond to that change and to maintain your blood pressure, and you might pass out. Astronauts have that same issue. And in fact, when we bring back crew members who have been on the space station for 6 months, when we brought them back on the space shuttle, we would actually bring them back laying down versus sitting up like we would after 2 weeks. So this is how we land the space shuttle. As I said, at this point, it's a 200,000-pound glider. These engines only operate during ascent. So they only operate for the first 8.5 minutes of the flight. After that, they're not used, and we have no air-breathing engines. These engines are the orbital maneuvering system engines that we use on orbit to do the deorbit burn. So we touch down at a pretty fast rate. We wait until just 300 feet above the ground to lower the main landing gear. That's because of the drag that's incurred when you lower that gear. Just think, if you're driving in a car, stick your arm out a window, you're going to feel that drag. Well, that drag is going to cause the vehicle to slow down. Because it's the glider, we can't regain that energy. So we wait until just 300 feet above the ground to drop the lower the main landing gear. When we drop the gear and create that drag, then we're committed to a landing. We touched down at about 195 knots. That's pretty fast speed on a 5-mile long runway. And then we have some drag chutes that come out of the aft portion here of the vehicle to help slow us down. So this is after flight. After flight, a lot of people don't feel very well. There's a lot of neurovestibular things taking place where your sense of balance is off. Again, your neurovestibular system is accelerated by gravitational forces. So for 2 weeks on orbit, your neurovestibular system hasn't been accelerated by gravitational forces. You're in a microgravity environment. So when you come back and you bend over, your neurovestibular system now is a little bit slower than it was, and it creates some nausea, some sense of dizziness, some sense of lack of stability. And so for the first 48 hours in the case of shuttle, much longer for our station crew members when they come back, we're not allowed to drive a car. We actually have a little bit of difficulty walking, not a tremendous amount, but a little difficulty walking, and especially maneuvering around the corner. So we take it easy for the first couple of days. So this is what the space station looks like today. So piece by piece, the solar arrays, the radiators assemblies, other modules, other robotic systems, piece by piece, those pieces were taken up over the next decade, all the way out till July of 2011. July of 2011 was the last space shuttle mission, the last space station assembly mission. After that time, the shuttles were retired. That was in part due to the Columbia accident back in 2003. And unfortunately, in this program, U.S. program, we don't yet have a replacement. We are building 2 replacement spacecraft. Commercial vendors, SpaceX and Boeing, are providing those spacecraft to us. The first crews have been assigned. They will fly hopefully next year, or as we would say in today's language, not soon enough. Now with this Soyuz malfunction that we've had, we have now lost all access to space from a human perspective, at least for some short, to be determined time. So let's hope we don't have to decrew the space station. It has never been decrewed since its infancy. We hope it can operate autonomously, but if things start to malfunction and there's not human beings there to fix it, it could be extremely problematic. So with that, I think hopefully that will frame some of your questions, and we can kind of move into the question and answer phase now.
Awesome. Okay, thank you so much. Those were some awesome pictures and videos. Those are really cool. So we'll get back to those questions in a little bit, but some of these questions are coming from the physics classes here. So a little bit about you. So what education did you pursue to become an astronaut?
So before I was an astronaut, I actually majored in biological sciences. I did an interdisciplinary major where I designed my own major. I really wanted to do biomedical engineering, but it did not exist. Engineering is found at most major universities now, but didn't exist back then. So I created my own and got an undergraduate degree in biology, master's. I was in the military. I was a pilot. Mm-hmm. They don't really let you go on time. So I worked on my doctorate while I was in the military, and I ultimately finished that degree at the University of Houston in industrial and systems engineering, specializing in human factors engineering and artificial intelligence systems.
Awesome. So yeah, like you mentioned, you were in the Army for 23 years before becoming an astronaut. Do you think that helped you prepare in any way for your time in space?
A lot of astronauts are military. In the early days, most astronauts were military. Today, it's probably somewhere between 40 to 50% are military. And that's because, whether it be the space station, the space shuttle, a Soyuz spacecraft, they're an aerospace vehicle. And you're operating an aerospace vehicle. It's a lot of crew coordination. It's a lot of systems information, malfunction recognition. And so I think the astronaut program will always have a heavy presence of military astronauts. So I think it definitely helped. I was an Army pilot, so I didn't have a lot of high performance jet time, I got jet time once I went to NASA, but I didn't have that in the Army. We fly helicopters and what we call fixed wing turboprops, so not jets necessarily in the Army. However, because of my aviation experience, that's why I was selected to be the flight engineer on all 4 of my flights. So I flew as a flight engineer.
Awesome. Okay, so I know you went through an astronaut training program, but what other prerequisites do you need to be an astronaut for NASA?
So there is a couple of basic requirements. One basic requirement is to have at least a bachelor's degree in one of the STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, or math. They used to actually carry a list of qualifying degrees. When it got to 200 different types of degrees, they finally just said anything in STEM.
Yeah.
We even have astronauts who are veterinarians. We have astronauts who are physicians. We have astronauts who are research scientists. So we cover the gamut from earth sciences. We have geologists, we have astrophysicists, we have pilots, we have engineers. So literally it's anything in the STEM field. The second big criteria, and I will tell you, even though the basic requirement is to have a bachelor's degree, almost all astronauts have some sort of advanced degree, if not a doctorate or a medical degree or a veterinary degree. Especially the civilian astronauts have doctorate degrees. Military astronauts, pretty rare to have a doctorate. As I said, the military doesn't let you go back to school for years at a time. So I believe there's only been about 2 of us who have had doctorates, and we did that on our own. The other big criteria is to be able to pass a physical. And some of the things that are disqualifying, for example, would be if you've ever had a kidney stone. And that's because when you're in space, your bones start to kind of excrete some of the minerals in your bones. You also diurese a lot on orbit, and so that combination makes kidney stone formation a real risk. So if you've already had a kidney stone, or even one step further, show a propensity to develop kidney stones. So for example, you wouldn't even know this. They would do a urinalysis, and if you had a high level of calcium in your urine, you might be disqualified for that in and of itself. Yeah. So there's pretty stringent medical criteria because, of course, if you're on the space station for 6 months, we don't want to have to do an emergency deorbit for a medical reason, unless something just really extreme came up. So they want you in the best possible shape when you're selected, because you might be training, especially in today's astronaut corps, you might be training for 10 years before you get your first space mission. So it's imperative that you're in very good physical condition and stay in very good physical condition to preclude any medical emergencies to the extent possible during the mission.
Nice. Okay, so you talked a little bit about training. So in the astronaut candidate training program, what is that like? Training in that for so long?
It's a combination of technical training. Obviously, you have to become familiar with all the systems on the spacecraft. You take a spacecraft as big as the International Space Station. That's a lot of systems knowledge. It's systems knowledge by the Russians as well. We have a Russian segment on the International Space Station that we have to know how to operate, and we have to know how to operate those systems as well as the systems in the European module, the Japanese module. Many times, like today, the astronauts and cosmonauts who are on board, not one of them is a Japanese astronaut, but they all have to be capable of operating those systems. You spend an awful lot of time learning the systems kind of from the ground level up all the way to the integrated space station operation. Language training is pretty important. Even though English is the language of the space station, we still have to be fluent in Russian to talk to our Russian colleagues. Wow. So Russian training is pretty important. A lot of team-based training. So we'll do training out in the wilderness in Canada. We'll do training under the water. We have an underwater facility where you can actually stay for up to a week, and then do exploratory dives out of that environment. And it's to emulate the spaceflight environment, to develop that team cohesiveness, that team performance that's needed to execute the mission task.
Awesome. Okay, so what was the first mission that you took to space?
So my first mission was STS-57, and on that mission we retrieved the European carrier satellite called Eureka. It had been launched. It was originally supposed to stay on orbit about 6 months and then be retrieved, and they were looking at things like, how does micrometeorite orbital debris damage affect spacecraft in orbit? Right now, there's over 900,000 pieces of trackable items in low Earth orbit. Low Earth orbit is just a few hundred miles above the Earth. That's the regime that we flew the space shuttle in. That's where the space station is. It's 215 miles up. It was a research satellite. So unfortunately, the Challenger accident happened, and that spacecraft ended up staying on orbit for about 2.5 years before we could go up on my first mission and retrieve it. Some of the other things we did is we flew a habitation module in the back, and in that module we had 22 different experiments. One of the experiments, for example, we flew human colon cancer cells, and we looked at how those cells developed in a microgravity environment. That's beneficial because without the force of gravity, they can grow in a very pure state. And then you can analyze where the active areas in those proteins so you can target pharmaceuticals to treat things like colon cancer. And then thirdly, we executed a spacewalk, and we were testing some of the tools and techniques that we're going to use to service the Hubble Space Telescope.
Nice. Okay, so you just mentioned the spacewalk. So how is that? Like, is it exciting? Is it scary, like being outside of the spacecraft?
So I've never done a spacewalk myself. I've always had to stay inside. I was too small. I didn't fit in our spacesuits. I was trained to do a spacewalk, but they, in a cost savings measure, reduced the inventory to just medium and large suits, and so that took out a large number of the female astronauts, and especially the small female astronauts. Based on talking to all the guys over the many missions that I've flown and the spacewalk and crew members I've had on my own missions, we train for spacewalks in a water tank. I think, and I've been in the water tank training for spacewalks, and I think if you can do it in a water tank, then you can do it in space. It's actually harder in a water tank. What you do is they drop you into the tank, lower you down on a crane. That spacesuit is filled with air. So if they didn't weight you out, you would rise to the top. So they put weights on you to make you neutrally buoyant. So even though that suit weighs 350 pounds, it's filled with air and it would float. So they put weights on your arms and legs to make you neutrally buoyant so you don't rise or fall in the water tank. But then when you're maneuvering around, when you're maneuvering equipment, you're still fighting the viscosity of the water. So it's more difficult than it would be, say, in a true microgravity environment. But it's the best analog, it's the best training we can do. Now, because you're fighting the viscosity of the water, when you actually go out in space, sometimes what you see is crew members translate and they get going kind of fast. It's easy for them to get going so fast that their feet kind of tip over their head, and then they have to control their rate of motion. The other thing, even though they know this isn't possible, when they're outside and you look down at the Earth for the first time, some people get the sensation of falling. That if they let go of the handrail, they would actually fall. Now, you're tethered to the spacecraft. You're grappling these handrails to translate up and down the segments to get from point A to point B. Because if you're not tethered to the spacecraft and you were to become detached, you become your own satellite now. Yeah. So now you're a satellite in and of itself, and you're 215 miles up, traveling at Mach 25. And that's a problem. Yeah. In the space shuttle, we could actually fire the jets up on the shuttle to maneuver back to you. We can't do that on the space station. So on the space station, we have a backpack, and in that backpack is some jets and some cold gas. And we have a very limited supply of gas, but should you become detached, you can pull a trigger, a small hand controller will come out, and using that hand controller, you can fire jets to kind of fly yourself back down to the space station. We have tested that system in microgravity. It works, and thankfully we've never had to use it, but it is there as an emergency procedure in case anybody were to ever become attached.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's crazy. So your body, so when you're going from Earth to space, does your body, like, how does it, like, adapt to, like, changes, or is there anything weird that happens, like, when you're going from Earth's gravity to obviously, like, no gravity?
Yeah, so the transition is pretty rapid as soon as you get to, so when you get to orbit and the main engine's cut off, you're in a microgravity environment. So anything that's not held down with Velcro or straps, starts floating. And anything that's come off during the vibration of ascent, kind of goes floating by. So at that point, you're in a microgravity environment. Some people, and that percentage is actually pretty high, some people get sick for the first time in space and on every mission. So it's called spaceflight adaptation sickness, space motion sickness, and about the advertised value is about 80% of all astronauts get sick in space. I will tell you, after watching people on 4 flights, it's probably more like 95%.
Yeah.
And the first thing that happens is a fluid shift. The fluid moves from your upper body, or from your lower body to your upper body. It does that because you don't have the force of gravity pushing down on you. So the fluids actually shift. So you get a very stuffy head. People's faces actually get very round, sometimes to the point you almost can't recognize them. We now know that actually causes some detrimental effects with our vision, because as the fluid shifts, your interocular pressure increases. We've actually, just in the last 2 years, demonstrated our brains swell because of that intracranial pressure. You grow when you get to space. You grow about 2 inches. The spine elongates. That's pretty good if you're my size, but the downside of that is as your spine elongates, your tendons and your ligaments are stretched. So low back pain is a pretty pervasive complaint of astronauts. Now, your body slowly adapts to space. My body adapts very quickly. For whatever reason, I have no idea. There's no predictors of who's going to, acclimatize to that environment quickly and who's not.
Right.
I never got sick. I never felt bad. I did have a backache, but I watched people as they get in a microgravity environment, and let's say one of the first things we do is we get out of that large orange pressure suit. So it's a rear entry suit. You got to put your head down and kind of squirm out of it. It's got a very tight neoprene neck dam around it, almost like a wetsuit. So it's very tight. And once you get out of that suit, you've kind of put yourself in an unusual attitude. If you're not in foot restraints and you're going through those motions, you could be tumbling in space. A lot of people start tumbling trying to get out of their suits. Well, your neurovestibular system doesn't feel like you're tumbling, but if you look at the wall and, look at some label on the wall, you can tell you're tumbling visually, but you don't feel like it. For most people, that discrepancy between what you're seeing visually and what you're feeling from a neurovestibular standpoint causes nausea and vomiting. It's very pervasive in the first few days. So a lot of people take medicines to help with that, but a lot of people get sick until they adjust to that microgravity environment.
Nice. So along with that, is it hard to sleep in space?
Yeah, actually sleeping is one of the hardest things, and I compare it to, because at the end of a hard day, here on Earth, you climb into bed and, you kind of feel your weight being taken off of you, and it's pretty relaxing. Well, in space, it's a pretty relaxing environment all the time. And depending on how you choose to sleep, physically you don't feel any differently.
Yeah.
So I found sleeping in space to be one of the most difficult things. I tried everything from just free floating, just crossing my arms, and we have a sleeping bag. It doesn't have arms on it, and so it's pretty weird to wake up in the middle of the night because you see floating arms everywhere. And we wear blinders because we're orbiting the Earth every 90 minutes. So every 90 minutes, you have 45 minutes of daylight, 45 minutes of darkness. So you have to intentionally darken the spacecraft
Yeah.
and put shades in the window to darken the spacecraft inside to make your body think it's nighttime. Otherwise, you're constantly going through these day-night cycles. So I found the best thing I could do is to literally take straps and strap myself very tightly to a wall. And that made me kind of feel like I was in bed, and then I could finally relax. But it was a lot of trial and error on my first flight to figure out how I could sleep. On my station assembly mission, I actually wedged myself between two bags of equipment so that I could feel that pressure pushing on me. That made me relax and made me be able to go to sleep. But I found sleeping on orbit is really hard. The other thing is that on most missions, you get to orbit and about 6 hours later, they put you to bed because you've been up all day, preparing for launch, going through launch, getting on the vehicle down in Florida. Well, it's really hard to get launched into space and 6 hours later, go to sleep. So, especially those first few days, you're pretty hyped up, you're pretty excited. You're in this brand new environment that you've never been in before. You're seeing Earth from this perspective that you've never seen before. So it's actually very difficult to relax and go to sleep.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. So. Okay. So you talked about the International Space Station a lot. Are there any misconceptions about the International Space Station that you'd like to address, or anything like that?
I don't think there's any misperceptions. It is truly an international vehicle. The way in which it works is all countries have contributed, all the countries that have contributed to the International Space Station, and that's the US, Canada, Russia, Japan, many European nations, and many others. Your contribution is tied into how much time you get to spend on the space station. So on every mission, there are US astronauts and Russian cosmonauts. However, for example, Canada's contribution were the robotic systems. A Canadian astronaut only flies roughly once every 7 years. So if there's two Canadian astronauts, one's gonna fly 7 years, 7 years later, the other one's gonna fly. They don't have a lot of flight opportunities. German astronauts from Switzerland, so astronauts from France. So they don't have nearly the number of opportunities because it's tied back into how much did you contribute to this orbiting laboratory. So that's why you're always seeing US astronauts and cosmonauts, and then you're seeing one or two astronauts from another nation on these missions.
Okay, so for our physics classes, what aspects of physics do you think of the most, or what parts of physics do you apply when you're on the space station?
There's a lot of physics in the aerospace. The whole concept of understanding what happens during a rendezvous, right? This goes back to based on orbital mechanics and physics. We didn't understand that early on in the space program. So the first person to ever try a rendezvous in space kind of figured this out. And again, and we always say in the space world, we have a lot of analytical tools these days. You have a lot of computer programs that you can run. Now, those computer programs are only good as the inputs that you put into them. And so when you get that result, we always encourage people, take a look at the result and figure out, does that make sense from a pure physics perspective? And believe it or not, even at NASA, sometimes we don't take the time to do that. We say, here's our answer. Maybe we say, here's the uncertainty with that answer, but here's the answer, and we progress on with our design. So on the first rendezvous, he kept trying to accelerate, and he would accelerate initially, but then, as I said, what would happen is his orbit, just a little bit, would be raised. Well, now again, if you have that racetrack analogy, now you're on the outer portion of that track. So from a relative perspective, you're relatively, it's going to take you longer to fly that track than it is somebody on the inside. And so therefore, our relative speeds were changing, they were increasing, so he would accelerate, look like he was getting closer, get into a higher orbit, and actually fall back and repeat the same thing. So they finally stepped back and said, oh, okay, now we understand from a physics perspective, how does rendezvous work, and how should we execute that series of burns? So, you know, everything we do is tied back to physics.
Mm-hmm. So this is a silly question. Do you actually eat astronaut ice cream?
No, we do not. So I could not even convince my own father that we did not. I think maybe a long, long time ago they tried it. If you've ever tried that stuff, you know it's really, really sweet. And so no, we don't fly that. But on the shuttle, we did fly dehydrated foods like the astronaut ice cream. The reason why we flew those on the space shuttle is because the way we generate electricity on the space shuttle is cryogenically stored oxygen and hydrogen. Mm-hmm. So you take gases, oxygen and hydrogen, you supercool them to less than minus 200 degrees, they become a liquid form. And then you can store them in tanks. So when those combined, we made energy, and we used that for electrical power. Was a byproduct of the combination of oxygen and hydrogen was H2O. So that water we used to help cool down some of our elements, and we also used as potable water. So because we were generating our own water source, it made sense to fly dehydrated food. Because if you can extract, you know, water weighs about 6.5 pounds per gallon. So if you can take that water out, because it costs about $10,000 for every pound we launch in orbit. So why take all that weight in food? You can take that water out, dehydrate it, and then we had a station on board where we could rehydrate the food. Now on the space station, we generate electricity using solar array. And so water is a limiting consumable. So we don't fly a lot of dehydrated food on the space station. We fly more foods like the meals ready to eat, the MREs that the military service members fly, right? So meals that are packaged that have a shelf life of a year or a year and a half or maybe even 2 years. Those are the types of foods that we fly because water is a limiting consumable on the space station.
Yeah. Okay, so we see astronauts in like a ton of movies. They're in Hollywood all the time. So what are the misconceptions about being in space that books or Hollywood have gotten wrong?
I don't watch a lot of the Hollywood movies because they do get it so wrong. Sometimes they don't very accurately portray what it's like to be in microgravity. I would say the one exception, when Tom Hanks filmed the movie Apollo 13, all of those scenes were flown in an aircraft we used to use called the Vomit Comet, and that would fly a series of parabolas. Mm-hmm. And so you would do a very steep ascent, and then you'd nose the aircraft over very rapidly, and you'd have a time of free fall of about 20 to 30 seconds. So they filmed Apollo 13. When you see them floating around, they're really floating around inside the cabin of this NASA aircraft for 20 or 30 seconds at a time. Now, the reason why we call it the Vomit Comet is because you would have a time of free fall, but then you'd have to do a very steep pullback again. So it's that transition between microgravity, 2G pull-out, microgravity, and they would do about 40 of these parabolas in a flight. It'd be like flying on a very violent roller coaster. So I'd say, you know, the microgravity aspect of it, they don't really portray very well. Mm-hmm. You know, in the movie The Martian, for example, he smashes his visor, and there's a scene where he holds his breath and takes duct tape out and puts, you know, tape on his visor. Trust me, that wouldn't happen. You know, you would literally be dead in a matter of seconds. Yeah. So Hollywood does not usually, with the one exception I would say of Apollo 13. I've not seen First Man. I want to see that. I want to see how they did with that one. Because I have a lot of respect for Neil Armstrong. I knew him personally. So we'll see. But I'm not a big fan of Gravity and other Hollywood movies.
Okay. So you won the Silver Snoopy Award? Yes, you did. So what is that?
So back during Apollo and a little bit of space history, we had a very tragic accident early on in the U.S. space program where we had a vehicle burn on the launch pad with 3 astronauts in it. So the Apollo 1 fire took place. And after that, NASA decided they wanted to recognize people who were doing things for the betterment of the safety of our spacecraft and the safety of our astronauts. And so at the time, Charlie Brown was very popular, and Snoopy, the character in Charlie Brown, the dog in Charlie Brown, used to fly his doghouse like he was in World War II, and he had his little leather flying helmet. So they adopted Snoopy as a symbol of how people dedicated their work towards bettering the safety of our spacecraft and the safety of our astronauts. So it's pretty unique. That award is given out only by astronauts. Typically, we surprise people. They don't even know we're coming. A lot of times we'll do it at their desk, but their families will be there. Everybody in the work environment will know we're coming. Or we, publish that there's going to be some organizational meeting, and they walk into the meeting and it turns out to be this award ceremony for them. But always given by an astronaut. So I think there's only 2 astronauts that got silver Snoopies before they were astronauts, but it's a pretty prestigious and a pretty important award.
That's awesome. So would you ever, if you had the opportunity, go back to space?
Yeah, I got that question the other day at an aviation risk conference. I would absolutely. Our next generation spacecraft are being built by commercial providers who have never built human spacecraft before. As you could tell from yesterday's events, human spacecraft is still very inherently risky. There's a lot of risk involved that never leaves our mind. But I took that risk before 4 times, and I would definitely take it again to be able to continue the exploration of space.
Nice. So now you're a professor. So how does your job now compare to all the things that you've done in your career?
It's different. Being in the classroom is different, but it's something I've always wanted to do. I've always wanted to inspire students to go have a career like I had. I'm getting to the age now where I'm too old to go do that. I probably couldn't pass a flight physical now if I tried. To encourage people to pursue an occupation that is committed to the exploration of environments that we have very little knowledge of. And space is still one of those environments. For decades now, we've been operating in low Earth orbit. That's just a few hundred miles above the Earth, To go off to another planet and establish a planetary base like on the surface of Mars, would just be phenomenal. The understanding of our own planet as we look back from space, as we explore space, but with a focus on what's going on with our planet, what's going on with our own environment. Just in the 12 years that I flew, I saw environmental changes, deforestation in South America, pollution. And so as you see those changes just over a decade of time, it tells us what we're doing to our environment is very devastating. Because in geological time, that's a tiny little slice of time. So I think it's important to continue the human exploration of space, to have people who are dedicated not only to being one of the few crew members that gets to go do that, but for every crew member that gets to fly in space, there's literally tens of thousands of people behind them working every day to build those systems, to make sure that they're safe, to make sure they continually operate, to make sure they're maintained properly. And so to be a part of that team, I think is a very important aspect.
Awesome. So for all the high schoolers who are watching this right now, what would you say to them if they wanted to be an astronaut when they grew up?
Well, when I was little, I didn't have the goal of becoming an astronaut because there weren't any female astronauts. Mm-hmm. But I did want to be a military pilot. And when I grew up, the internet didn't exist. So I couldn't Google, women military pilots. That technology wasn't there. Well, nobody told me I couldn't do that. My parents didn't tell me you can't do that. My teachers didn't tell me you can't do that. So I grew up with this goal. And when I was in high school, they changed the rules and they started letting women fly in the military. And so I would say if you have a dream, pursue that passion. Now, in the pursuit of that passion, if you look at it like a ladder and you say, okay, the very top is being an astronaut, but I got to take it one rung at a time. Just be cognizant you might have to stop on one of those rungs. So if you do, pick a path where if you have to stop, you're going to have a passion for what you do. You're going to be good at what you do. You're going to love doing. You're going to love getting up in the morning and going to work. You want to have a job. You want to have a profession that when you wake up in the morning, you're excited about it. You can't wait to go do it. It's, you know, it's not a job, it's a profession, and you love it. So I'd encourage you, whatever that is, whether it's architecture, whether it's arts, whether it's science, whether it's becoming an astronaut, don't let anybody tell you you can't. Everybody is capable. We live in a country where there are no bars to what you can achieve based on your race or your ethnicity or your gender. You can do anything you want. So I'd say just have that drive, just have that passion, and then commit yourself 100%. It takes a lot of work. Sometimes I get the question, what's the easiest degree I can get and become an astronaut? Mm-hmm. And fundamentally, that question is flawed because you don't look for the easy way out. Yeah. You look for the hard things because they are hard, because they are challenging, and you want to take on those challenges.
Awesome. Okay, that's all the questions I have for you. So thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you. Everything was so interesting. So yeah, thank you so much. Okay.
All right. Well, thank you guys. Have a great day. And hopefully you've learned something from this. And I've really enjoyed talking with you.
Awesome. Yeah, I enjoyed talking to you too. Thank you.